We advocate for the G7 to maintain formal channels of communication with groups like the African Union, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the G20, China, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, so that the paths that the G7 leaders carve out in these different issue areas will be welcomed by these other parts of the world as models that they should also follow. Hi, I'm Victor Cha, Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea Chair at CSIS, and I'm here to talk about our recent report with Dr. John Hamre, Emily Benson, Max Bergman, Aaron Murphy, and Caitlin Welsh, titled Bending the Architecture, Reimagining the G7. Our report tries to think about how we can make the G7 more effective as an institution of global governance, not today, not tomorrow, but 10 years from now, as the international system becomes more and more complicated, both in terms of geopolitics and geopolitical competition, but also in terms of opportunities for cooperation, whether we're talking about new uses of artificial intelligence, scientific advances in biology, in medicine, as well as in clean development and climate. Our report, a collaborative work of CSIS, basically identifies 3 areas where we think the G7 could be improved or reformed in order to play this larger role. The first area is in terms of agenda setting. The G7 host each year gets to decide what the agenda is for each G7 summit. And yet, G7 leaders have already identified 9 issues, as we describe them in the report, of global significance that are priorities for G7 leaders. So we would like to see greater consistency in terms of agenda setting, probably by a troika, informal troika of the past G7 host, the current G7 host, and next year's G7 host, to ensure consistency in terms of the agenda. Second, we think there should be an expansion of the membership of the G7, not to make it as large as the G20, but simply to add Australia and South Korea to the G7. Both are critical players in issues like critical minerals, memory chips, emerging technology. They are advanced industrialized democracies that are the 12th and 13th largest economies in the world. And they add regional balance to the G7, which is now heavily dominated by Europe. Finally, we think the G7 should be more inclusive, not in the sense that it must create new members from all over the world, but that it needs to maintain connections, serious connections, with places like Africa, the so-called Global South, emerging and middle economies, as well as the Muslim world. So we advocate for the G7 to maintain formal channels of communication with groups like the African Union, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the G20, China, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, so that the paths that the G7 leaders carve out in these different issue areas will be welcomed by these other parts of the world as models that they should also follow. This is important for both the effectiveness and the inclusiveness of the G7. To read the full report, Bending the Architecture, Reimagining the G7, please visit csis.org.